Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event, and it's a very a great pleasure to be able to participate in this and to solidify our collaboration with UNESCO, especially. And before I start, I'll just say a quick congrats to Barb Perry for receiving this UNESCO Research Chair, which I think brings great prestige to the university. And also very well reflects our values in terms of what it is that we're trying to do at the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. My name is Peter Stoett. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities. Before we get started, I would like to say that as a university community, we are dedicated to increasing our awareness, understanding, and gratitude for the lands we share. Ontario Tech University acknowledges the lands and people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. The lands we are situated on are covered under the Williams Treaties in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the greater Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. These lands remain home to a number of Indigenous nations and people, and as a university community, we are thankful to be welcomed here in friendship. I'd like everyone to take a moment to reflect on the traditional territory that you may be on in whatever country you're in, and your own personal relationship to the land. So thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's announcement and panel discussion. As I said previously, this chair appointment really does reflect the values of our faculty, its commitment to social justice, and to the key sustainability goals of UNESCO. This builds on our faculty's strong scholarly record, as well as engagement with affected communities. So I'd like to begin today by introducing Dr. Stephen Murphy, who helped make all this possible, President and Vice Chancellor of Ontario Tech University. Sir, if you'd like to say a few words.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Peter. And it's a privilege to be here today. I want to congratulate, of course, Dr. Barbara Perry on her appointment as UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies. I really would like to spend a little bit of time commenting on the importance of the work that Dr. Perry does as part of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism. I think when this was created, we well knew that there was a need out there to be studying all forms of hate and online hate. I don't think we had any idea of how the pandemic would ratchet things up or the importance that this would play. Barb probably did, being very able to see into the future, but all that to say, it's taken up an enormously important place, not just on the Canadian landscape, but globally in terms of the impact that the center is having. And the appointment builds on the profile of the university, of course. Peter talked about the importance around the social justice aspects. We're also very proud to talk about tech with a conscience as part of Ontario Tech. For me, that always means that whenever we're thinking about technologies, whether they be new or existing, we think about the ethical implications of those. And I think that Dr. Perry's work is dead center in that, thinking about, are we using platforms to their best effect? Are we actually improving humankind? And clearly the answer on so many of those fronts is no. And how do we counter some of the effects that run so negative to the very institutions that so many of us, of course, believe in so deeply that we've devoted our entire careers to. I'd also like to talk, if I could, about how this center addresses local, national, and global trends that threaten targeted communities. So I've already talked about how it's both local, national, and global, but I think it's really important to talk about the targeted communities, the number of people who are subject to hate that usually don't have any voice. And I'm really proud of how this center plays an important role of shedding light on not only the voices that surround hate, but on the victims of those voices, and again, what it is that we can collectively do to counter that, so that it isn't, solely a matter of people being bullied and feeling extremely alone. I think that this center provide some very rational discussion around the fact that unfortunately this is pervasive. These things need to have very comprehensive strategies to be able to combat them. We need everybody on board, and that speaks to the importance of having UNESCO, and for this being a truly international center and an appointment as Barb as UNESCO chair. It also, of course, continues to enhance our engagements with all kinds of communities. And I just want to say that both personally and as being really proud of our institution, I think that this alignment between UNESCO and the chair in hate studies is a natural one. It's a perfect fit for both organizations and combining our values. And I think that in this time, it's more important than ever that we view every decision through how does it align with our fundamental values and where we're going. And I think this is a great example that we can all be proud of. So I'd like to thank UNESCO for the support in this, and I'd like to congratulate Dr. Barbara Perry on this very significant milestone. So thank you very much.
Thank you, President Murphy. I would like now to introduce our next speaker, who is Rhoda Muse, the Secretary General of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, who joins us from Ottawa today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm truly pleased to be here today to celebrate what you should all consider a significant accomplishment, the launch of the new UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies. It is always an important moment when we welcome someone new to our eminent Canadian UNESCO family. I'd like to start by extending my heartfelt congratulations to the newest chairholder, Dr. Barbara Perry, and to Ontario Tech University. You can be very proud of this major achievement. Please allow me to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ottawa, which is in the traditional, unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. It is a beautiful place, and we honor the peoples who have cared for this land for many generations. As you may already know, UNESCO is the UN educational, scientific, and cultural organization. It was created after World War II to rebuild the world's educational systems, and its overarching goal is world peace. It works toward this lofty goal through initiatives in education, science, culture, communication, and information. At the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, we work to carry out UNESCO's mandate and priorities here in Canada. To say that achieving world peace is a multifaceted task would be quite an understatement. The UNESCO Chairs Network is just one part of that complex effort, but it is an important part. It is a highly effective way to mobilize not only citizens, but nations. The global network now includes more than 917 chairs in 114 countries. The 30 UNESCO chairs we now have in Canada are particularly active in this network. We recently attended the 30th anniversary of the program in Paris. It was quite impressive to see the strong bonds that the Canadian chairs have developed with each other over the years, as well as the fruitful relationships with UNESCO chairs located in other countries. When UNESCO first created the Chairs Network 30 years ago, its vision was to build bridges among and between universities, communities, researchers, policymakers, and civil society broadly. The chairs are created to help UNESCO fulfill its mandate and to sharpen the focus of its efforts. UNESCO also gives them a unique role in fostering intersectoral relationships, co-creating knowledge and building capacity, including through North-South and South-South partnerships. Put in simple words, the central aim of a UNESCO chair like the one we are celebrating today is to find solutions to complex, critical, global issues that no individual institution or country can solve on its own. The UNESCO chairs have special significance in Canada because our commission played a pivotal role in helping establish this international network. We continue to work hard to better showcase the contributions of the chairs and highlight the uniqueness of this prestigious network within the research ecosystem in Canada and the world. There will be multiple opportunities over the coming years to work alongside Ontario Tech University and Dr. Barbara Perry. The establishment of a Canadian UNESCO chair in hate studies is perhaps more relevant now than it has ever been, given the rise of hate-related incidents and hate crimes across Canada over the last several years. Building inclusive society is a pillar of our Commission's work, and understanding hate and extremist movement in all their forms is essential for building a base to continue this work. Dr. Perry has been at the forefront of this work and research in Canada for years, and is widely recognized as a leading expert in this field, particularly as it relates to right-wing extremism. We are very proud to have Dr. Perry as part of the network and look forward to our close collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda, and again, thanks to UNESCO for collaborating. This is a fantastic opportunity for both of us, I think. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Barbara Perry and congratulate her once again on her recent appointment as UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies. And Dr. Perry, perhaps you'd like to say a few words before we move into our panel discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, those of you on the panel, but also our attendees. I think it's nice to be able to rally around. I see that there are, some very local from our own faculty, and I think some folks from around the world as well. So that's an exciting beginning, I think, to our journey of building a broader network here. This is, as you can imagine, a very exciting moment. It's actually the culmination of a process that began probably more than 5 years ago, I think, when Peter first joined us as Dean of the Faculty, and very early on approached me with the idea of applying for a UNESCO chair. So I would like to begin by thanking him for his faith in me and for his subsequent support throughout the process of the application. I should say that we also owe a great debt of gratitude to President Stephen Murphy. So thank you for your ongoing support of the initiative as well. We're grateful too to the donors that have supported the work of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, where the chair kind of lives, if you will, in particular Meta and Unifor, and many generous individuals who have contributed to the work that we do, and especially have facilitated a lot of the community work that we're thus able to do. I also want to thank my colleagues in the faculty, and especially the steering committee, the founding members and the newer members in the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism, who make this a dynamic and stimulating environment. It's, without that kind of support, without that kind of energy, I think these sorts of initiatives wouldn't be possible. And of course, I want to thank the partners who've had enough trust in me to embark on this journey, in spite of the fact that many of you were strangers at the outset when I approached you for partnership. Clearly, though, you are people and organizations that from the get-go have shared my commitment to countering hate to the extent you're willing to take that leap of faith and sign on to this endeavor. Others among you are old friends. Happy to see you at the table here, with whom I have shared projects and pints, I might add, around the world. This moment would clearly not have been possible without the support of all of you here and abroad. I should add that this moment wouldn't be necessary if we didn't find ourselves in an era in which hate, hostility, anger, myriad grievances weren't bubbling over across the globe. At home, we've seen hate crime increase over 70% since 2019, very short period of time. We've seen the number of hate groups triple in about that same time. Online expressions of hatred and hostility are immeasurable. Mass murders motivated by misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and more have become all too common, both here and abroad. Too many nations have seen the resurgence of far-right politics that play to the baser instincts of othering and then have begun to roll back human rights, in fact, to threaten the very foundations of democratic societies. Regional hatreds continue to take lives in countries in all parts of the world. We seek through the chair to identify and challenge both parallels and peculiarities in how othering permits violence across cultural settings. Growing north-south disparities have accentuated the frustrations that originate in social inequalities. The pressures of global capitalism have put material resources at a premium, frequently with the result of engendering conflict grounded in ethnic competition. In these contexts, identity has been politicized and exploited in ways that demonize the other who's argued to stand in the way of progress, stand in the way of prosperity. Disputes around the redistribution of cultural capital are also underway. In particular, the discursive and material perquisites of citizenship are in transition, such that identities become polarized around questions of rights, responsibilities, and belonging. Popular perceptions of who is deserving and undeserving of inclusion typically revolve around cultural markers, whether they be grounded in race, religion, gender, or some complex amalgam of all these and more. Hate crime thus arises as a means of defending what appears to be under threat, whether it's status, wealth, privilege, or territory. Here in Canada, a common refrain is that challenging hatred requires a whole of government response. I've for some time said that it demands more than that what is needed is in fact a whole of society response. This reflects my longstanding commitment that multi-sectoral approaches will be most impactful. So while we must continue to work with policymakers and lobby for appropriate legislative and policy responses, we must also engage civil society organizations locally and globally in a collective endeavor to push back against the structural and rhetorical trends that have created the current climate of hate. And these efforts must be grounded in the sorts of research that many of us are engaged in. The Chair in Hate Studies is poised to provide a context for the creation and mobilization of knowledge that can inform the work of governmental and non-governmental agencies singly, but more importantly, collectively. To that end, the key objectives as we define them in our proposal and continue to define them is to first encourage interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral and comparative research and scholarship in the areas of hate and extremism. Secondly, to promote community engagement and awareness through broad exchange and dissemination of research results across the public and private sectors. Third, to support training of students, postdoc fellows, academics, practitioners, and the public to build capacity against hate in Canada and abroad, including through faculty, practitioner, and student exchanges. And fourth, to develop solutions to benefit Canada and the international community through evidence-based policy development, analysis, and assessment. Peter referred earlier to the fact that the chair reflects several of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Among these, gender equality. So the chair will produce research on enhanced awareness of and propose interventions against gender-based violence, including violence against women and against trans community. This also aligns with the recent announcement by the Canadian government of a $50 million commitment to developing services for survivors of gender-based violence, as well as investment in services for victims of hate crime. Another sustainability goal, reduced inequalities. The work of the chair will counter oppressive narratives and practices with the intent of maximizing inclusion of those pushed to the fringes, culturally, economically, geographically, across the globe. And peace, justice, and strong institutions, core institutions that enable hate to flourish, law enforcement that trivializes hate crime, courts that fail to uphold human rights protection, for example. The chair will work toward enhancing awareness and understanding of the impacts and consequences of hate among justice workers, law enforcement, prosecutors, judiciary in particular, and develop educational and training materials for this audience. As we begin this work, I asked the current and even potential partners who might be listening in to consider the following questions. What can we learn from one another? What resources can we share with one another? How can we mobilize communities against the local contours of hate? How can we amplify our voices to influence policymakers and legislators? So let's get to work, beginning with this panel on the global dimensions of hate. So again, I just want to thank everyone for being here and for the support that I've had from so many far and near for building the chair. And I really sincerely mean it. Time to get to work. There's so much for us to do, and I look forward to the kinds of partnerships that we are able to build here.
Thanks, Barb. Let me congratulate you once again. I just pick up very quickly on a couple of points you've made. As a long time student of genocide myself, it's quite clear over history that demonization, scapegoating, the intellectual and emotional manipulation that goes into hate campaigns almost always precede genocide and mass violence. And it's something that we must keep an eye on, of course, and to do it on an international level. There's a lack of immunity from the disease of hate, and it doesn't matter where you're located. And that's, I think, why it's so important we have an international panel here today. Barb mentioned what's happening in Canada. Of course, many of us follow the United States very closely, but my colleagues around the world, whether they're in Brazil, Egypt, I could keep naming countries, but I won't bother. But this is truly a global phenomenon right now, perhaps more so than it's ever been, and that's why I think it's so important that we have this international panel with us today. And there's also a link, I think, that's quite clearly emerging between the degradation of democracy and this type of activity, especially in terms of right-wing extremism, which Barb, of course, is one of the foremost experts on globally. So. And finally, Barb, you mentioned it yourself, and then Rhoda, you mentioned it too, policy implications, right? So it's not just a question of knowing this is going on, but what on earth can we do about it? And how can governments help, but also civil society, as you emphasized. So these are all excellent points. Thank you so much for raising them. Barb, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're going to have a panel discussion on the global dimensions of hate, and Barb is going to introduce the panel and lead the discussion. So please proceed.
Great. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate it. Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to bring together this great panel here. Some of the partners that I have invited, strong-armed, enlisted into the work of the chair. It is an international panel. I should say at the outset, it took us a while to work this application through. I think we submitted it in, I want to say 2018 or 2019, so it's taken some time for it to come through. So some of the organizations that were early partners have, are now defunct, and many of the contacts I had in those in some of those organizations have moved on. So we're beginning. Some folks have been here from the beginning, and I really appreciate that. Juan, for example. Really nice to have you here from multiple points across the country and across the globe. So I really appreciate that. So we're going to lead off with maybe the furthest, sort of the furthest afield, and that is Harsh, so that if he needs to, he can leave us early and go to bed. It's very late there. Just want to offer a little introduction here. Harsh Mander is a human rights and peace worker, columnist, writer, researcher, and teacher who works with survivors of mass violence, hunger, homeless persons, and street children. He's currently a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. He's also the chairperson of the Center for Equity Studies, Delhi, where he also edits the annual India Exclusion Report. In 2017, he established and led the important national initiative, which he called the Karwan-e-Mohabbat, or the Caravan of Love, which tries to counter rising hate and fear in the country with love and solidarity. The Karwan visits the families of those who have lost loved ones to hate, violence, and lynching for atonement, solidarity, healing, conscience, and justice, and to promote goodwill and trust between communities. Harsh, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours. Harsh, sorry, you're muted.
Harsh, you're still on mute, yeah.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I said it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today at a time when we see the world is desperately in need of understanding ways to respond to hate. And to find so many people passionate about these same questions is wonderful. And warm congratulations to you, Barbara. There are signs all around us of our world in tumult. Democracy and fraternity are being slowly but surely snuffed out in many parts of our world by the rising politics of hate. Leaders in both electoral democracies and authoritarian states are increasingly legitimizing hate and bigotry, thereby hollowing out democracy, eroding the ideas of equal citizenship and fraternity. If you're a minority of any kind, religious, racial, ethnic, caste, gender, disability, a life with dignity and security has become increasingly precarious in most parts of our world today. We today inhabit a world in which the odds are high that your neighbor will not look like you, worship like you, speak your language, eat, dress, sing, dance, love like you. The question this raises, how do we respond to these people who we feel are different? Are we welcoming, curious, friendly, or are we fearful, resentful, full of hate? Few countries in the world are today immune from the rise of far-right leaders who encourage the second path, who foster fear and hate against people of different faiths, skin, color, beliefs, language, ways of life. I'm here today to speak about my own country, India, and its crisis of rising hate. India today finds itself in a frighteningly dark and violent space of fear and hate. It is a particularly frightening place to live in if you're a member of a minority, especially a Muslim, or of a disadvantaged caste, and in some parts of the country, a Christian. India has strayed very far from the humane and inclusive country that promised equal citizenship to people of every faith, caste, and ethnicity. The country that was imagined and promised in our freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi, and the India written into our constitution. It was his insistence on humane and inclusive citizenship, and particularly that India would belong equally to its Muslim citizens, that led to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi just months after India won her freedom. It is India's tragedy that people steeped in that very hate ideology that led to Gandhi's killing are now in power in India. They're setting aside the central pledge of our constitution that the new social contract that we the people would enter into would be to build a land assuring equal citizenship in every way for people of every faith, caste, gender, language, culture, ethnicity. It would not matter which God you worship or if you worship no God, you would be an equal citizen in every way. But the Hindu supremacist project of India's rulers today stands for a radically different imagination for India. It rejects the idea of equal citizenship. Instead, it requires at its core a radical, violent rupture between India's Hindu majority and those of the hated others that it constructs, India's Muslims and Christians. Those ruling India today seek a country that belongs most to its upper caste Hindus. In this India, they may allow Muslims, Christians, perhaps even, and Dalits to live, but only as second-class citizenship, in fear, always subordinate to the Hindu majority, without the assurance of rights. But their preference is that the Muslims and Christians should be expelled. India's leaders are more determined than ever to push the country down this horrific path of hate, fear, and blood. And remember, India has 200 million Muslim citizens. Is it correct then to believe that India is in real and present danger of a genocide? Genocide Watch lists India as a country with very high chances of slipping into genocide, the mass extermination of people of a hated identity. Many early signs are there in India of such a possible violent catastrophe. Let me give just a few examples of these early signs. There's first a stunning rise in toxic hate speech by senior leaders of of government and political parties. Somebody tracked what it called VIP hate speech rise since the Modi government came to power of 1,130% compared to the preceding regime, led sometimes by the Prime Minister and much more shrilly by his Home Minister, several union chief ministers. This hate speech pandemic stigmatizes, taunts, insults, and sometimes openly incites violence against India's Muslims. Taunts and dog whistles, like claiming that the earlier government was occupied not in providing welfare, but instead building walls of Muslim burial grounds, something that the Prime Minister said, or calling Muslim termites. They falsely construct and depict Muslims as bigoted and violent oppressors of Hindus in history, as breakers of Hindus' temples, and in contemporary times, variously as infiltrators, unpatriotic, loyal to Pakistan, terrorists, sexual predators, love jihadis, cow killers, child breeders, and infiltrators. Christians are portrayed as deviously deploying overseas donations to bribe impoverished people into converting into Christianity under the cloak of humanitarian services. Even Mother Teresa is not exempt from these hate construction. Online and in public gatherings, a range of other extreme right-wing supporters, from people in saffron robes, jobless youth, to upmarket tech doyens. They are even more candid in spouting their hate, openly calling for boycotts, expulsions, mass killing, genocide, and mass rape. Sometimes, for the record, a thin official line is drawn, claiming official distance from these fringe elements. But this claim wears thin because hate mongers are rarely punished, get bailed quickly if they're at all arrested, and many are inducted instead to party positions and the government. Even the Prime Minister follows some of the most poisonous hate spreaders on Twitter. Other signs of dread of this other pandemic of unrelenting hate is direct violence targeting India's Muslims. We've seen, a growing, really worrying, epidemic of brutal lynching, eerily reminiscent of Jim Crow's America. These have become increasingly routine. Mobs surround and brutally kill Muslims, sometimes Dalit men, on unproved charges of cow slaughter. All of this is videotaped, circulated to millions on social media and consumed. The Karwan-e-Mohabbat, or the caravan of love, was something that I felt we needed to build, because we have to find ways of fighting hate, not with hate, because only hate would deepen, but with a different idiom of resistance based on love. Learning a lot from Mahatma Gandhi's example during our freedom struggle. So we resolved that we would go to every home anywhere in the country where somebody has lost a life to hate lynching. But we would go like we would go to our own family, to say we share in your grief, to cry with them, to seek forgiveness for what we have become, to assure them that we will be with you in your battles for justice and as you piece together your life, and we will tell your story. We started with one journey, we went on and made 30 journeys till the pandemic hit us. And people would tell us over and over again, that I wish they'd just shot him. I wish they'd just stabbed him to death. Why did they have to torture him so much before they killed him? Why did they gouge out his eyes, smash his genitals? And this continues. A child is beaten for drinking water in a temple, a youth for daring to sell bangles to Hindu girls, another for selling meat. And then there's a political project as well of rendering Muslims irrelevant, fewer and fewer. I mean, the ruling BJP is proud of the fact that it does not have a single Muslim representative in parliament, in both houses, or in any legislature anywhere in the country. And we are talking about 200 million people, totally unrepresented. And then we had the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019, which for the first time gives undocumented people of Muslim faith and identity. It really, for the first time, makes a distinction based on religion, lesser access to citizenship. And Genocide Watch draws ominous parallels of this with Myanmar, where the Rohingya were first declared non-citizens, then brutally attacked and expelled. Many governments are also passing what are called love jihad laws that enable the police to criminalize Muslim men who consensually have romantic relations or marry Hindu women. And a large number of people are imprisoned, even under national security laws, for, say, trading in beef, without explaining how this violates history, violates security. I'll end now. It's tempting for supporters of the ruling establishment to dismiss claims of possible genocide as alarmist, but the Holocaust Memorial Museum report warns of the dangers of such denial. We know from the Holocaust what can happen when early warning signs go unheeded. What is at stake is the country and the world we wish to grow old in and leave for our children. I was in Germany for a few months, learning from the German people how they courageously confronted their horrific Nazi past. East German pastor Sean Lemmer, speaking to Susan Neimer of what other countries can learn from Germany, said, "You can learn that no country, no culture, no religion is immune to falling into the abyss into which we fell. And once it begins, there will always be people who shut down their conscience and side with the strong man." Can we recognize that our leaders have taken India to the very edge of this abyss? My desperate hope is only that enough of us in India and around the world don't shut down our conscience. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, for that opening. It's really just chilling trends, I think, that you have shared with us, and frightening trends as well, that I think really highlight the dangers of the escalation of rhetoric, starting there, right? Starting with, as you say, political rhetoric that that demonizes communities and others, and in fact incites not just hatred but violence against those communities. So thank you for those sobering thoughts. We're going to move now to Heidi Bayrak, who's an expert on American European extremist movements, including white supremacy, nativism, anti-Semitism, and anti-government movements. She earned a doctorate in political science from Purdue in 1998 that specializes in European fascism and far-right movements. She holds an holds MA degrees in political science and economics. She is the author of numerous academic publications on extremism and co-edited Neo-Confederacy, a critical introduction, published by University of Texas Press in 2008. Bayrak is an often sought speaker at conferences devoted to battling hate and extremism. She's been interviewed by hundreds of publications, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, LA Times, Guardian, BBC, and others. She's appeared repeatedly on major television networks and in documentaries and radio programs exploring extremism. She's testified in, She has testified in Congress on issues related to white supremacy. Before co-founding the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, Bayrak led the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project, the premier organization tackling hate and anti-government movements in the United States. Heidi, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you for having me. I just want to start by thanking Ontario Tech, UNESCO, and congratulating you very warmly on this appointment. I'm so happy that this is happening at a time when already you, Harsh, have laid out sort of the reasons why this is such a serious problem. I'll talk a little bit about what we're facing in the United States. I think there are a lot of parallels here with Canada, in other ways with India. There's this rising global tide of hatred that is, presenting itself in different ways in different places. But I think in many ways is the challenge of our time, and one that hasn't been taken seriously enough, I think, in recent years. One thing I think is interesting is to see this appointment and to realize that hate studies as a field or a place of emphasis is actually quite rare across the world. And that is incredibly unfortunate, because the challenges over time, whether it's, Germany in the 1930s or what India is facing today, or what's happening with hate crimes and terrorism and targeted communities seem to always be with us. So they get worse, they get better, but it's such a huge challenge, and I'm really glad to see you all taking this on directly. It's a big deal. In the United States, we have somewhat like what Canada has faced. We're at levels of the highest hate crimes ever in the time that the statistics have been recorded by the FBI here. We have seen mass domestic terrorist attacks in recent years targeting multiple communities. This past May, the Black community in Buffalo, New York was targeted, but there was a shooting in an El Paso Walmart, a synagogue in Pittsburgh, one in Poway. Sadly, I could go on with this list. So the violence is real, coming from hateful ideologies. We're also in a situation where there is a movement now in the United States that blends together belief in hateful ideas with basically an anti-democracy position. And, I think for many of us, it was good to see in these midterm elections that the US just had that many of the candidates who are what we call election deniers here, people who believe the 2020 election was stolen from Trump and that our election system is manipulated, that those candidates tended to not win because honestly, a lot of them were running on platforms saying they would make sure to manipulate the elections in the 2024 upcoming presidential elections. But many of those candidates didn't lose by much. So we have a movement now in the United States that represents millions of people who believe these things, and it's not going to disappear overnight. Probably the most horrifying thing about the situation in the United States, besides the growth in hate crimes, besides the rise in domestic terrorism, is that we have a situation right now where ideas that used to be confined very much to relatively fringe movements, right-wing extremist movements, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and so on, are now part of the discourse of mainstream conservatives in the United States. This is something that is a relatively new phenomenon, and in many ways can be put at the feet of leadership mainstreaming these ideas, in particular Donald Trump, but not Donald Trump alone. One of those ideas that has been mainstreamed is this thing called the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It's a white supremacist idea that people of color, refugees, immigrants, are intentionally displacing white populations in what they view as their historic homelands. This has an anti-Semitic version in which Jews are blamed for orchestrating these events. This idea, which is absurd and false, is actually now something that dozens and dozens of candidates in the United States in these past elections espoused. So what we would like to think should be something that remained on the fringes is now actually quite popular on the right in the United States. It's a little amazing that there is no shame in spreading a white supremacist idea by people running for office, people in our, the Republican Party and our conservative party, especially given that those same domestic terrorist attacks I talked about in Buffalo and El Paso and in Pittsburgh were orchestrated by people who believed exactly the same thing, the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. It's hard to understand how you could run for office on an idea that is specifically terrorist inspiring, but that is something that is happening in the United States. There's also a pretty large contingent of people, estimated around 20 million, this is based on the University of Chicago research, who form essentially an insurrectionist class in the United States. They believe in the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Many of them believe in another crazy conspiracy theory called QAnon, which also has anti-Semitic forms. And they believe that violence is perfectly fine to use to overthrow the US government. This had its expression most clearly in the events of January 6th here in the United States, where a conglomeration of extremist groups like the Proud Boys, militias, and others, together with conspiracists from QAnon, joined a far larger contingent of what we call MAGA supporters, MAGA Republicans, people who believe in Donald Trump, to storm the Capitol in the United States. And this research also found that many of those people who stormed the Capitol came from counties in the United States that have been experiencing demographic change, in fact, relatively rapid demographic change in recent years. And that change, that demographic shift away from a white majority in the United States, isn't going to stop anytime soon. So it adds to the level of challenge that we have in fighting hate in the United States, because one thing that happens in those communities is certain people react with hateful ideas. Some other relevant trends in the United States, but much like in Canada, we are seeing a rapid growth of people attached to white supremacist and other extremist ideas on the right. We used to, count, I worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center for a long time counting hate groups, which is one measure of this. The scarier measure, I think, nowadays is when you look at online forums where there are millions of people engaged in these ideas. They're networks, not really organizations. And those numbers just seem to be on the rise constantly. There's a lot to be said about the technological aspects to the rise in hateful ideas. I know, Barbara, that you're going to be working on that at the center, and as the chair, I think that's one area where collaboration across places is going to be very necessary. So we have a rise in white supremacy, individuals identified by that, but we also have in the United States an extremist scene on the far right that's a lot more complicated than it used to be. This isn't just about white supremacy. This isn't about rabid hatred of government or conspiracy. We have misogynistic movements that didn't exist the way they do today. Just a few years ago, people willing to kill women because of their hatred towards women. We have a movement that is deep also into the Republican Party of anti-LGBT thought, right? Attacks on the queer community, the trans community, that are in many ways just as vicious as the horrible things we've seen said about immigrants in recent years in the United States coming from the right, and that are very deep into the mainstream. This isn't something that's out there on the fringes. The US may have beaten this back a little bit in these midterm elections, but we have rising right-wing populism that is, of course, threatening governments in many parts of the world. This is true in pseudo-authoritarian areas, in democracies that are on a knife's edge in places like, for example, Hungary. I'm not sure we can actually call that a democracy anymore. Places like Poland, but also Giorgia Meloni's new government in Italy, the new government in Sweden. This list could go on and on and on. And I think that this is, the challenge that goes along with hate. These movements tend to fuel themselves by othering, as Harsh described so eloquently, and by demonizing targeted populations. And if this continues, it's a threat to democracy. It's obviously a threat to those populations, and it's one that's shared in multiple countries at the same time. Tech, I think, is a thread that runs through all of this and a challenge. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Heidi. Yeah, I mean, what you were saying resonates very much with us in Canada. I think that the trends have run in lockstep, maybe, a couple of months behind, but certainly we've been very much influenced by that same normalization of hate, the same dramatic increase in hate crimes and the presence of far-right groups. But I think that, already one of the trends that we're seeing, one of the common threads that we're seeing here is the extent to which, there is a climate of hate that is engendered and constructed by political and pop cultural narratives, as well, as we see this embedded. I mean, we think about Kanye West, Ye's, sort of anti-Semitic rants over the past couple of months, and that's something that really grabs the youth, the younger generation in particular. So I think that's something that we need to pay close attention to as well. So thanks for that, Heidi. And next, we will ask Juan Nell to speak. He is a registered clinical and research psychologist, research professor of psychology at the University of South Africa, and a National Research Foundation rated researcher with recognized expertise in LGBTI mental health and well-being, hate crimes, and victim empowerment and support. More generally, Juan is the former president of the Psychological Society of South Africa, the former member of its council, and founder member and deputy chair of the SciSA Sexuality and Gender Division. Juan served as expert witness on behalf of SciSA as amicus curiae in the John Kwalani homophobic hate speech constitutional equality court case in 2012 that ran from 2012 to 2021. He furthermore represents SciSA on international structures and fields related to his research towards furthering their profile as a learned society. In this regard, most noteworthy are his roles as first leader of the research subcommittee of the South African Hate Crimes Working Group, second as the co-representative on the International Psychology Network for LGBTI concerns, and third, leader of the SciSA African LGBTI Human Rights Project aimed at positioning the society as a regional hub towards promoting well-being and human rights for LGBTI persons in Africa. So welcome to you, Juan, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Barbara. And perhaps to start with acknowledging what a privilege it is to participate in this launch of the UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies, and in particular, congratulations to you and your team at Ontario Tech. So I'm going to use my time to respond to what the current contours of hate and its manifestations seem to be in South Africa. And to start off that conversation, to say that South Africa is often applauded for its peaceful and rapid transformation from an authoritarian apartheid regime, renowned for its institutional discrimination, among others, on the basis of race, to a society founded on democratic values and a constitution, one that preserves the principles of human dignity, freedom, and social justice. And indeed, a constitution that's been lauded for being very progressive and with quite a few world firsts. Nevertheless, the country is continuously challenged by its past. This is evident in struggles with pervasive criminal violence and victimization in general, but then seemingly also that it's unfeasible to try and curb the ongoing occurrences of hate victimization that are based on, among others, elements of race, nationality, religious grounds, or sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI. So in South Africa, in scholarship policies and the laws, we distinguish between the terms intentional unfair discrimination, hate speech, and hate crime. And they are, however, deemed as interconnected, all essentially anti-democracy, anti-equality, and contrary to the human rights culture that we're trying to establish. But individually, they refer to considerably different occurrences. And I'll only speak to this intentional unfair discrimination, which indeed is differentiated from what is not deemed unfair discrimination, and that is when measures designated to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination occurs. And here you can think of South Africa's transformation efforts, so-called broad-based Black economic empowerment for so-called designated groups, in other words, the previously disadvantaged. I think in some ways we are unintentionally being bedeviled by what is our history of race categorization that's just changed its shape and form. And you'll see that play out when I reflect on some of the vulnerabilities that are quite pronounced here. But indeed, we see a lot of intentional unfair discrimination. We see a lot of hate speech. And in our understanding, these two categories, if allowed unchecked, do create the breeding ground for hate crime, which has been very worrying for civil society in particular. I would assume also for our political leaders, but it doesn't always seem like that in terms of a lack of a sense of urgency. So we have seen these periodic and brutal upsurges in hate victimization, and this does detract from the progress with our constitutional project as we talk about the advent of democracy and trying to install a human rights culture. It is this holistic understanding regarding South Africa's past and the consequences thereof, and a lack of monitoring of hate incidents at the time that informed early discussions for those that came together to form the South African Hate Crimes Working Group. And it was in the absence of hate crimes provisions in the law that this multi-sectoral network of civil society organizations with a strong ethos of social justice and equality or inclusivity was established in 2009 to spearhead advocacy and reform initiatives pertaining to hate crimes in South Africa. And important to note, the groupings that were particularly brought together in those early days were those working with non-nationality and then SOGI and religious sector. And that was the case then, and unfortunately actually continues to be the case today. So the Hate Crimes Working Group initiated a 5-year longitudinal empirical study in 2010, and it really got underway from 2013 to 2017. And it was on the nature and impact of hate victimization, including all three of those categories that I mentioned earlier. And indeed, we saw a pattern of hate incidents directed at non-nationals, SOGI, and members of specific religious groups in particular. The convenient sampling that we employed is important to emphasize. The fact that we only focused on 5 of the 9 provinces, that we documented 1,060 cases with a lot of effort, I might tell you, of which 945 were retained for quantitative analyses. And although not a prevalent studies, the vulnerabilities to hate victimization related to non-nationality was in 45% of those cases, SOGI 28% of the cases, and religion 14%. And in our estimate, it is quite an accurate reflection of when compared to anecdotal evidence and media reporting in South Africa over many years. For specific reasons that we elaborate on in the related report, we do think that vulnerabilities regarding race that came out of 9% may be underreported. And not only is it because there's a lack of civil society organizations focused on race, interestingly enough, with our very strange history, but then also a lack of representation in the Hate Crimes Working Group. But then I suppose what is important to highlight as well is that we found that in 68% of these 945 cases, indeed, the harm that was inflicted on the victim, the hate incident, in other words, was accompanied by hate speech. And the defamatory remarks sometimes would precede a specific incident by months. And certainly, just to emphasize at that point, it couldn't be reported to the police specifically because it's not a crime category then, and it still is not the case in South Africa. So I'm just going to reflect a little bit on work that the Hate Crimes Working Group has put together since then, and in particular in April 2021, we put together a very significant letter of concern aimed at Parliament based on the lack of progress with the Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, and indeed documented that since the Hate Crimes Bill was reinvigorated in October 2019 till April 2021, there had been a significant case of a severe instance of hate crime per month. And again, similar to what I reported earlier, it seemed to be that non-nationals and SOGI-based victimization were the most prevalent. I suppose just interestingly, internationally, from my understanding, it's often race and religious-based hate victimization that seem to be most prevalent. So perhaps just a little bit of comment on the specificities in South Africa. When it comes to xenophobia, The first wave of xenophobic attacks that were documented date back to 2008, so before the hate crimes working group was established. We've since seen similar waves, and particularly aimed at people from other African countries, so not non-nationals in the broad, people from other African countries. And that happened in 2013, twice in 2015, and in February 2017 yet again. And it would start in one province and really create quite a wave through all the other, well, not all the other provinces, but several of the other provinces. And it created such an international furore at some point that early warning system was established between Nigerian and South African governments, given the spate of xenophobic attacks. At some point, a whole group of business people were chartered out of the country because of the onslaught. And indeed, one of the most significant instances that raised a lot of concern was when the Zulu king, Goodwill Zwelithini, in 2015, famously again said foreigners must pack their bags and go home. Very often the sentiments are that they steal our jobs, they're abusing the public services that are meant for South African citizens, and that they are responsible for crime. So the othering that goes with that. I'm just going to reflect a little bit on SOGI, which is perhaps the area of work that brings me to hate studies in the broad, or historically that was the case. And I'm just going to read a citation of one of the civil society organizations. Since the dawn of democracy, LGBTIQ plus South Africans have been brutalized, raped, and killed across our nation. The list is long. Names like Sizikele, Sigaza, Salome Mwasua, Eddie Simelane, Gift Makua, Sana Supe, Nare Mpwele, Kerfan Fortuin, and Linda Pele may stand out, but so many others did not make the headlines. So many more have gone unrecognized at hate crime victims at all, because even today, we still have no hate crimes legislation in this country. And then I suppose at more or less that same time, April 2021, unsurprisingly signed by 33 LGBTI organizations and their allies. And I say unsurprisingly, because indeed of all these vulnerable sectors, most probably the LGBTI sector is the strongest, the most organized. Put together a letter and a whole social media campaign that was addressed at Parliament around enough is enough, justice for queer South Africa, speak up Cyril, and urging government to do more against homo, bi, and transphobic victimization. But yeah, I must say, still to no avail. I'm going to make a few comments around race and racism. And just to mention that we've got I suppose, the reference to fair discrimination on the basis of race that I mentioned earlier. There are two instances of what was later seen as an outbreak of racist remarks on social media, and that goes back to 2015, 2016 in particular. And it was followed by acts of vandalism and displays of racism on South African university campuses. But in that time, the names of Penny Sparrow and Vicky Mombag, both white women, became synonymous with the so-called endemic anti-Black racism in the country. Sparrow likened Black African beachgoers to monkeys. She was fined for racist hate speech relatively soon after. Momberg was sentenced for effective 2 years in prison for criminal injuria for a racist lashing out at a Black African police officer who came to assistance after alleged smash and grab incident in 2016. But on the flip side, I suppose, suggesting of a bit of a hierarchy of hate, we've got a politician, Julius Malema, who is the leader of a major political party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who seemingly gets away with truly murderous speech, if not murder, and I'm putting that in inverted brackets. There's a repeated slogan over many years about kill the boer, kill the farmer. That was recently found by the courts to not be taken literally, and that was indeed part of South Africa's struggle history. It's going to be before the courts now in the near future again, because it's been taken in appeal. In the past, he's said as well, I'm not telling you to kill yet. And because he added the yet, he got away with that as well. And then very recently, on the 16th of October, he actually said to his party members and supporters, never be scared to kill in defense of our economic emancipation of Black people. He continued saying to those attending the conference, a revolution demands that at some point there must be killing because the killing is part of revolutionary acts. And I suppose what I'm wanting to point out with the flip side is that the Human Rights Commission found, well, not that it was before a court of law as yet, but in response considered this to constitute hate speech. But they actually merely just addressed a letter to the EFF and Malema, providing him with an opportunity to retract the statements, apologize, and give certain undertakings as to the future conduct in hope of a positive response. He, of course, rejected that, and that case will play out further. I'm going to mention two more cases and then I'm going to conclude. I suppose just again, a bit of a reflection of the hierarchy of hate that is so evident in South Africa. There are two other cases. The one is a homophobic hate speech case, the Klelani case that also came up in my introduction and that the Psychological Society of South Africa was part of, and myself as an expert witness. That dates back to 2008. We were before the courts for from 2012 to 2021 before the highest court of the land found it to constitute hate speech. The other case is an anti-Semitic one, Suku, that dates back to 2009. Again, only the beginning of this year did we have a constitutional court finding in that regard. What has been beneficial of both those instances, it's given the country and the lawmakers some direction regarding the limits of the freedom of expression and what a definition of hate speech would be for the country going forward. So perhaps in retrospect, time well spent, but truly a lot of effort that went into that. So I'm going to conclude at that point, and I'll talk about initiatives driving efforts to challenge those patterns if there's an opportunity later. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. I appreciate you sharing, some of the concrete examples that you've uncovered in the research and that have occurred subsequent to that. One of the points that you made very early on, if I heard you right, was that there's some denial of the problem and there's a silencing of conversations around hate crime. And I think that that's sort of the flip side of the, the speech, the othering speech, the dangerous speech by politicians is, a denial of the problem is also a means of minimizing the threat and therefore enabling these patterns to persist. So I thank you for reminding us about that as well. Okay, we're still, there's one of our speakers is not shown up yet, but we will continue apace here and to introduce the dynamic duo of Jen Schwepp and Amanda Haynes, good friends and colleagues. We go way back. So glad to have you both on the team. I understand Amanda is going to speak for you, but I will introduce you both, beginning with Jennifer Schwepp. Having graduated with a BCL from UCD, University College Dublin. Did I have that right?
UCD.
Okay. Jennifer was awarded an open postgraduate scholarship while completing her LLM by research. She was then awarded an internship with the Federal Defender Program in Chicago, after which she worked as a legal researcher in the Office of the Attorney General and as a legal researcher for the Law Reform Commission before beginning work at University of Limerick in 2004. Jennifer was president of the Irish Association of Law Teachers for 2009-2010. She completed a graduate diploma in academic practice at University of Limerick and won the Small Group Teaching Award at the university in 2010. She was awarded a National Award for Excellence in Teaching by the National Academy for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning in 2011, was a finalist for the European Award for Excellence in Teaching in the Humanities and Social Sciences in 2012. Her research interests lie in the areas of hate crime and reproductive justice, and she has published widely on these topics. Her work in the area of hate crime looks at the criminalization of bias motivation and explores the potential of introducing hate crime offenses in an Irish context. She's co-editor of 2 major collections in the area of hate crime with Oxford University Press and Palgrave Macmillan, and is published in the Journal of Hate Studies, the Oxford Handbook Online in Criminology and Criminal Justice, the Northern Ireland Legal Quarterly, and the Irish Jurist. She is co-director of the International Network for Hate Studies. She's also founder and co-director of the UL-based Hate and Hostility Research Group, the only academic research group in Ireland dedicated to exploring and understanding hate crime in an Irish context. Her work in the area of hate crime with Dr. Amanda Haynes has been funded by the Irish Research Council, the EU DG Justice Program, and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Amanda Haynes is an associate professor in sociology at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Her research interests center on the analysis of physical, discursive, and classificatory violences and their relationship to prejudice. Her current interests center on hate crime, policing, stigma, and minority access to justice. She has been published in high-ranking journals such as New Media and Society. Her published works include the edited collections Critical Perspective on Hate Crime, Contributions from the Island of Ireland. Her work has been funded by the European Commission, the Irish Research Council, and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Amanda's commitment to her students was recognized twice by the University of Limerick, where she was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award in 2005 and 2011. Following her service on the executive committee of the Sociological Association of Ireland, she was elected president of the association for the 2008 term. But I think that the center is now, and I keep forgetting the title, but it's broader than Ireland now. It is a European network. So perhaps you can start off with that, Amanda. I think the other thing that I wanted to note is that this is, that Amanda and Jennifer are fabulous examples of the mobilization of their research and their knowledge, not just in the interests of public policy development, but also in the interests of educating their students, as you see from their many teaching awards as well. So a fabulous blend, I think, that we see there. So it's all yours, Amanda. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And yes, it's the European, we've rebranded as the European Centre for the Study of Hate. And you're very welcome to check out our website and make contact with us. I want to thank you very much, Barb, for the opportunity to participate in this event, and to congratulate you and to congratulate the university on the award of this particular chair. So I've been asked to talk today a little bit about the Irish context, and I think I was drawn first of all to discussing the relevance of Barb's work on doing difference to understanding hate in Ireland. In her theory of doing difference, she tells us how offenders respond to the manner in which people from stigmatized and marginalized groups do difference is essential to understanding hate incidents and hate crimes. Particularly where this involves minorities claiming a status or a position in society other than marginality. And hate crimes and hate incidents, of course, are the means by which those who would defend the status quo, who would defend hierarchies based upon personal characteristics, punish those who are perceived, as we would say in Ireland, to have gotten above themselves. This year in Ireland, we celebrate the centenary of the formation of our state. And Professor Perry's theory of doing difference is key to understanding how what she refers to as a permission to hate was built into the very formation of the Irish state. Our nation was constructed around the notion of a monolithic national identity. The imagined citizen was unilaterally constructed to conform to what has been characterized as the WISC identity: white, heterosexual, Irish, sedentary, that is not nomadic, and Catholic. In the years that were to follow then, the notion of homogeneity was defended by both the state and the church, often working in tandem, as well as embodied in the actions of individuals who occupied positions of power within society more generally. This is another aspect of Barb's work, which I draw on heavily and I think is really relevant to understanding hate in an Irish context, in particular, that link between the structural and the individual. Difference in Ireland was dealt with by being exported or incarcerated. exported among the diaspora, who included not only those who were fleeing poverty, those who we talk about more commonly, but also those who were fleeing repression. Incarceration was the solution to those who would not or could not conform. This is a past which we in Ireland are still coming to terms with, and it has been linked in recent years to so many new historical tragedies that have been uncovered one after one, and which the public encounter. And as we do so, what has become increasingly apparent, we think, is that these tragedies are characterized not only individually by the mistreatment of women or of children or of LGBT people or people with disabilities or people of color, but on a cross-cutting basis by the actions that were taken to suppress difference. In the years that have followed, it's arguable that the ordinary people of Ireland have changed and progressed faster than the institutions of our society. Research with the general population, and indeed our referenda, show that increasingly large numbers of Irish people support equality across the grounds of race, religion, disability, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. In contemporary Ireland, we pride ourselves on our modernity, on our progressive sensibilities, and rightly so. But Professor Perry's work highlights how embedded individual hate crimes and hate incidents are in the social and in the cultural context. We cannot presume, therefore, that the relationship between individual hate crimes and our history of oppressing difference through institutions can be undone with a decade of progress. The data that's available to us from crime and victimization surveys with minority communities in Ireland shows the truth of this statement. Despite the increasingly positive disposition of the average Irish person towards difference, we continue to exhibit high levels of anti-LGBT hate crimes, of racist hate crimes, including towards our Indigenous, traditionally nomadic community of Minkerry, also called Irish Travellers. For example, and this is just data from the crime and victimization surveys conducted by the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, who are, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, a really important source of data on the experiences of minorities in Ireland. Their EU-2 survey found that 21% of sub-Saharan Africans surveyed in Ireland experienced 6 or more physical attacks in the 5 years preceding the survey due to their ethnic or immigrant background. The 2019 LGBT survey that they conducted found that 37% of LGBTI people in Ireland surveyed said that they were harassed the year before the survey. The EU average was 38%, so we're pretty much there on average. 11% in Ireland had been attacked in the 5 years before the survey. In 2019, the EU FRA also found that more than half of Minkerry of Irish Travellers surveyed had experienced hate-motivated harassment in the 12 years prior. Notably, on that last point, the research that has been conducted by Professor Schwepp and myself shows that Irish people are less ready to recognise this last form of hate against Minkerry, against Irish Travellers, our Indigenous ethnic minority community, as racism. Reflected in political discourse, which has sometimes depicted racism as a whole as being an imported social problem, Irish people are least able to recognise our most localized form of prejudice. That in Ireland we lacked systematic data on so many other minority communities' experiences of hate crime and hate incidents, and that we're so dependent upon the very important work done by EU FRA, is indicative of an ongoing willful ignorance on the part of the state that is part of that history, I would argue, regarding individual acts of hate towards those who are perceived as different in our society. Our state-funded data collection mechanisms rarely expend resources on probing experiences of hate crimes and hate incidents among our minority communities. And as of yet, hate crime does not exist as a legal construct in Ireland. Professor Perry has previously described us as an anomaly among Western democracies in not having hate crime legislation. One of the most important developments that's happening at the moment in Ireland is the rectification of that particular situation. Having attempted twice previously to introduce laws addressing hate crime and having encountered across decades and across a diversity of governments drawn from different parties, efforts have until now been stalled by the argument on the part of the state that hate crime was dealt with appropriately simply through the discretionary power of judges to consider whether or not the presence of a hate element should aggravate a sentence. The legitimacy of this dismissive perspective was supported by the near invisibility of hate crime in official statistics, something that scholarly research, including that of Professor Stoett and I, has been essential to addressing. In the context of mounting pressure from international bodies, bolstered by a growing body of research evidence documenting the prevalence of hate crime in Ireland and documenting the inadequacy of current criminal justice system responses, the government has finally sponsored a bill addressing both hate crime and hate speech. This week, the Parliament in Ireland, Dáil Éireann, voted on the second stage of that legislation, which will for the first time create a legal framework for addressing hate crime through the courts. While the proposed legislation is far from perfect as of yet, the process of drafting and debating the provisions has exemplified the importance of synergies between the academy, civil society, and lawmakers. Through the Coalition Against Hate Crime, 20 national civil society organisations representing a wide range of commonly targeted groups have worked together with academics to document the need for legislation and to promote an informed political and public discourse regarding legislative options and to amplify the voice of civil society within those discussions. Separately, academics have been consulted by and actively worked to support drafters and parliamentarians. Hate crime as a social ill is, of course, a very complex issue to address, and addressing it through the blunt, if essential, instrument of the criminal law is particularly challenging. The role that academics have played in informing the legislative process in Ireland has highlighted the resources that universities can bring to bear upon this process, the depth of specialism, the expertise, the rigour, the breadth of perspective, geographically and temporally. The work of academics in the field of hate studies, like that of myself and Professor Stoett in an Irish context, as well as people like Dr. Lucy Michaels, has been cited in recent debates as informing the thought processes of our parliamentarians. The capacity to access scholarly research is important to making decisions around legislation which are evidence-informed. Drawing upon systematic comparative research opens up new possibilities for addressing the challenge of hate and promotes reflexivity and critical thinking. There is, of course, not one way to address hate crime through the law, but many possible approaches. The collaboration of legal scholars and social scientists provides insights not only into the existence and form of different legislative models globally, but also insights into how these translate into intended and unintended consequences shaped by the cultural, social, and political contexts in which they are embedded. And indeed translates into insights in relation to the importance of creating structures to ensure the effective implementation of legislation throughout the criminal justice system, and the need for those legislative responses, if they are to be truly effective in addressing hate crime, to be supported by wider educative and civil society interventions. All of these contributions to perspective are made possible because scholarship at its best is not inward-looking or parochial. It is collaborative and comparative and benefits from the collective knowledge generated by communities of practice and disciplinary communities. It's our hope and belief that Professor Perry, as the first UNESCO chair in hate studies, will be a catalyst for precisely this type of scholarship. We believe that she will serve as a bridge between scholars who work within particular jurisdictions and countries, between researchers who work with different minority communities on different forms of prejudice and different manifestations of hate, and between different disciplines who each contribute something unique to the study of and combating of hate. and indeed between those who seek to address individual and structural causes. We're confident that Professor Perry will provide a platform that will enable us to be more effective as scholars and researchers and as contributors to policy and practice change. Both as a consequence of the significance of her own work and of her personal charisma, Professor Perry has a track record of bridging divides, not only among scholars, but between knowledge generators and knowledge users. She has proactively sought to connect the work of the academy, practitioners, and policymakers, and to promote research for impact. This is precisely the mode of engagement that we require in the field of hate studies. The social ill that we seek to understand and to counter is complex and multidimensional. As such, so too must be the explanations that we develop and the tools that we deploy to counter the varied manifestations of hate. This is not a challenge that can be met through isolated efforts. The UNESCO chair holds the promise of building a cross-cultural, cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary community of practice with the requisite collective competencies and resources to make a significant contribution to tackling hate. Moreover, the prestige of the appointment and the status of UNESCO chair can help to ensure that this community of practice is not only active, but has access to those with the power to enact change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. That was just brilliant, and I couldn't have summed up the aims of the chair and the potential of the chair any better than you did in your closing statements there. So thank you so much for that. And I also want to applaud, by the way, the work that Amanda and Jennifer have done, really in terms of the impact it's had on the conversations, the discourse, and the push towards finally, hopefully, legislation around hate crime in the Irish context. I think what's really important also is the reminder that you've given us about the historically and structurally embedded preconditions for the forms of hate that we've been talking about. These are not just new expressions. Perhaps they're new expressions, but they are not new trends that we're seeing. The kinds of issues that we're addressing are really something that are sort of bred in the bone of many of our national histories, and that in spite of the efforts of civil society organizations and others, continue to inform policymaking and the institutions that are meant to respond to these problems. So, work to be done at the individual level and obviously at the structural level as well. As we move towards our last two speakers, I just want to remind you, if you've got questions bubbling, that the Q&A function is open. So go ahead and put some thoughts in there, and hopefully we will have time at the end to get to those. I want to welcome now Claire Thomas, who is the longstanding Deputy Director of the Minority Rights Group International, which is an organization that focuses on tackling discrimination and exclusion experienced by ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities and Indigenous peoples. For the past 4 years, Claire has been leading MRG's work as part of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, which focuses on the impact of hate speech on religious minorities in Iraq, Myanmar, and Pakistan. Claire has also been involved in MRG's work to support Roma communities in Europe to identify and respond to hate or anti-Gypsyism. Claire will focus on ways in which the UNESCO Chair in Hate Studies presents opportunities to contribute to ongoing debates and actions to address the growing phenomenon of inter-community hate. So Claire, thank you for joining us, and it's yours. You're still muted, Claire.
So sorry about that. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm particularly delighted because this chair is so important to people like me and the partners on the ground that I've been working with for the last 4 years. I've shared with Brad a few links to some of the publications that MRG's done, so I very much hope that Brad might be able to share that through the chat or in other means with the group. That would be really helpful. So MRG has been working, as Barbara mentioned, on this sort of bottom-up, this grassroots up approach to understanding and tackling hate. So I think we're an example of the group that Amanda was talking about in terms of needing access to this scholarly thinking. We definitely experienced that in the communities we were working with in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Myanmar, until we had to leave after the coup, that there is a kind of dearth of scholarly attention to hate. Even though, as Barbara was saying, it has been bred in us and hate has been something which people have experienced for millennia. We're going through a bit of an upcycle in terms of othering and generation of populism through identifying other people as targets, I think globally. And that's something certainly the religious minorities, ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples are reporting to us. Of course, the mechanisms of transmitting that hate is changing. But one of the things that really struck me from the work in Pakistan is how much of the hate being expressed is not online. How much of the hate being expressed in Pakistan is written or spoken face to face. Also, one of the things that we found in Pakistan was how hard it is to get people to report hate. So I think a lot more scholarly attention to that. I think quite a lot of work has been done in Europe, and I think Amanda again referred to some of that. But I think outside of Europe, people are very inured to the hate that they experience. They don't consider it worth reporting. And obviously, if it's online hate, there may be other ways that you can capture it. But if it's face-to-face or things like signage in shops or banners or other public statements, graffiti, then that may well never be captured in other ways. Again, I do apologize for coming in late. It's one of the occupational hazards of working for an NGO, is that there's always more things that you would like to do than you have time to do. So I don't want to speak for too long, because I might be replicating or duplicating what others before me have said. But I mean, you can see from some of the work that we've been doing that we are ploughing our way through what is a very difficult terrain for us. There is academic support, but it's not as joined up as it could be, and we're not as connected with it as we could be. And there, I'm speaking about people in London, people in Geneva. I'm not speaking about people in Lahore or people in Erbil, who are even further away from these techniques or issues that they need to be aware of. In Europe and North America and so on, in many parts of the world, we can talk about legislating our way out of hate. I just want to sound a note of caution, and Amanda may already have mentioned this, but in some parts of the world, efforts to legislate away from hate or even discrimination have been quite troubled, with legislation being dropped in Iraq, for example, when it was criticized for not being consistent with international mandates on freedom of expression. So one of the things I think we've taken away from our work is that two things. The first thing is that the hate chain is our attempts to intervene in chains of hate are only as strong as the weakest link. So, for example, you can organize for a particular platform to restrict hate on their platform, but we saw very swiftly in Myanmar, when that was done by Facebook, now Meta, that hate moved on to other, more accommodating, less responsible, if I say, or less monitored platforms very swiftly. And because of this kind of fungibility of hate, if you like, one of the things that we've taken away from this is that the ultimate aim maybe has to be to reduce the consumption of hate rather than the production of hate. So that's just something that we would really love the academic audience, the academic sector to pay more attention to. Why is it that posts that contain anger or hate or vilification seem to be more shareable than most posts that contain positive images, with the possible exception of cats and kittens? I mean, you all know what I'm talking about. But if we could really get to the bottom of understanding why human nature operates in that way, that would be super helpful. So understanding why people consume hate and what we can do to intervene in that would be lovely. And this shows us that the prestige of a chair like this really will help to bring people together and will help to have those debates, help visibility of the academic literature that is available for people on the ground to use and benefit from. And I'll leave it there, but thank you very much again for inviting me.
Thank you, Claire. And I think the important thing about the work of MRG is that it really does, highlight the global nature of the sorts of threats. I actually did a segment on hate crime for MRG, the annual reports. I can't even remember, maybe 8 years ago or something. But I think you're absolutely right too, that there is a dearth of scholarship, especially outside the West, or even consideration of this, what we think of as hate crime. And that was part of the impetus, I think, behind the pursuing the chair, is to expand that network from sort of the global North and be more inclusive of things that are happening in the global South, and contributing expertise and just partnerships with people working there in academia and civil society organizations as well. So very much looking forward, hopefully, to working with MRG again in the future. So thank you for that. And okay, so we're going to close it out by coming home again, and this was quite purposeful to close out with the Canadian example here. And Cam Stoett is actually with the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, which I often sort of applaud and laud as a great example of multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary work in this space. So Cam Stoett has been active in the field of diversity, inclusion, and human rights for over 20 years. He's received several awards for his work, including the Jewish Repairing the World Award, YMCA Peace Medal, Baha'i Community Racial Harmony Award, the Alberta Outstanding Contribution to Community Adult Learning Award. He has been honored with an eagle feather from Elder Doreen Spence and has been gifted a Blackfoot name of Mikostafa Pinnakum, Red Morning by Herman Yellow Old Woman. Under his leadership and guidance, the Calgary Police Service received the Calgary Immigrant Aid Society's Calgary Immigrant Aid Society's Immigrant of Distinction Corporate Diversity Award and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Diversity Award. He has advised hundreds of corporations, nonprofit organizations, and all orders of governments in developing equitable practices and removing barriers for all people. Cam is presently the president of the Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, education and engagement consultant for Alberta Hate Crimes Commission, Alberta Human Rights Commission, and the Rotary District 5360 Indigenous Relations Chair. So Cam, no pressure, but I leave it to you to close us out.
Sure, thanks, Barbara. And I'm going to have a presentation. I hope people don't mind. I'm not. I don't want people to see my face. So I don't want to see my face, but I like graphics. So I'm going to share. Was it showing up okay on the screen? Okay. So yeah, thanks, Barbara, and congratulations. I think this is long overdue. Hate crime in Canada is not new. It dates back for many generations. I want to first acknowledge that where I'm located on is in Treaty 7, which is in southern Alberta. I'm based out of Calgary, but Alberta is made up of treaties 6, 7, and 8. And that's where the Alberta Hate Crime Committee operates out of. It's important to address and acknowledge that our Indigenous population in Canada, they have been one of the most impacted groups by hate and racism for generations. And in research that we did back 15 years ago, we identified that they were the most impacted by hate. However, they were also the least likely to report. Somebody here mentioned earlier about reporting and lack of reporting. Well, our Indigenous population have been a victim of hate and racism for many generations. So it's important that we acknowledge that, and we all work. Everyone here, I know, is all working to address it for all their populations. So Alberta Hate Crimes Committee, we're a nonprofit organization that looks at convening those that are on the ground, that are most likely to be impacted by hate from many, many different ways. And again, there's that old saying about nothing about us without us. And it's important that we look at that, and particularly the big areas that we looked at from the Hate Crime Committee. And just so you know, the Hate Crime Committee has been around for over 20 years. It came into existence just after the attacks on the World Trade Center. There were people, there were academics back in the, doing this back in the in the 90s and the early 2000s. And there was community, there was police doing this, but no, everyone was doing this on their own. And so the committee looked at this and looked, what can we do to bring all the players together, all those impacted that their heart and minds are in it. We know that, and again, in most countries, and everyone here probably identify that most people want to do the right thing. Most people are not haters. So the majority of your community want to be involved in positive transformations, but they don't know how. And so we thought we'd bring together a community, those individuals or organizations that want to address this, the cops. So that means law enforcement, but also legislation enforcement, whether it's human rights commissions or other organizations that have legislative authority to prosecute hate. And last, the Crown. So that means the prosecutors or the government agencies that colleagues that are working for governments that are asked to address this. So why is this all important to us? Think, and I found this quote. I didn't realize you were doing this long, Barbara, but in 2001. And again, why do we address hate? It's because it just does not, like most other crimes that affect the individual, hate is a message crime. And so it impacts not only the community, and not only the individual, but the community. And it polarizes it, it demonizes the community. I think that's why we're all very, very interested in this issue. Hate crimes in Canada, they're covered under the federal criminal code legislation, very narrow legislation that is actually not prosecuted very often because there's such a high bar for this. Barbara talked earlier about the number of hate crimes has increased. And most notably where it increased is in the area of religion and sexual orientation and race and ethnicity. Just be aware that these are reported to the police. These are crimes that are reported to the police that we know it's underreported across all our jurisdictions. Most of the hate crimes in Canada are in this area of race, ethnicity, and religion. And within where they happen, the violations are in the area of mischief, assault, and uttering threats. again, also be aware that these are how police, the ones that are reported to police, and how police report them to StatsCan or the URC. Some examples of hate crimes that I wanted to share, just to let people know, because a lot of times we talk about it academically in another context. These are real people impacted by real crimes. The one on the left, there's some individuals throwing rocks and garbage cans at a same-sex couple walking down a very nice area of Calgary, and that they were assaulted. You see in Winnipeg, there's again, there's a swastika and some comments against the Middle East market. Another example of a hate crime, which actually is not technically covered under criminal code, is an assault here against a homeless person. One of the things I also wanted to bring out is that the way that we collect the data and evidence does not actually show who the victims are. And so we know that there's a lot of intersectionality of people that are impacted by hate, that they do not just identify as gay, lesbian, indigenous, their spirituality. And so the stats are also, it's less about the stat and more about the person and their community, who that they are kin to. Now, one of the things the hate crimes committee did right off the bat, and this is working within consultation with police and government, is looked at hate incidents. And because a precursor to hate crimes can be or is involved with hate incidents. And so when we see a rise in hate incidents, we'll also see a correlation with the rise in hate crimes. These may or may not be able to be prosecuted by any legislation, but it's important that we collect it. And so with the some of the hate examples of on the left here, we've got an individual who's making derogatory slurs against an individual in Edmonton. And on the right, I'm sure a lot of you heard about the provocative symbolism of the Freedom Convoy that happened in Ottawa, as well as down in southern Alberta. And so one of the things that we believe, like everyone here does, believe in evidence. And so we were blessed to have and still have a member of our community, Irfan Chowdhury, who developed this Stop Hate AB website. And so we are asking people that if there is a hate incident, to report that. And so we've been collecting data for about the last 4 or 5 years, I guess. And so to document that, to provide some support for the victims, if we can, and to provide some better evidence for policymakers. You can see our hate incidents were actually going down until 2020 and 2019, and then everyone here has noticed, I'm sure, an uptick in hate and racism in their communities. 2022, we've only collected the first 3 months, so I'm assuming at the end of the year we'll be able to up people with our hate crime statistics numbers. Now the motives and the types, they're very similar to hate crime. You'll see that the people are reporting race and ethnicity at 70%, and religion is 9%. So again, it's that 70 to 80% covers those two areas. And the types of hate incidents include derogatory slurs, hateful symbolism, intimidation, racism, or graffiti and defacement of property, which again would be crime, but may or may not be actually identified or reported to the police. We always strongly encourage people to report things to the police. Location of these, we know hate happens across our society. But as you can see, where it's happening, it's not necessarily under any identifiable areas, even within provincial or federal human rights legislation. Public spaces, online, shopping. And so there's lots of places where hate happens. And so this comes down to, what the mandate of the Hate Crime Committee is. And to take a quote from Kofi Annan, knowledge is power, information is liberating. Education is the premise of progress in every society, in every family. And so the committee really looks at, facilitates, and is encouraging Barbara and her team and everyone here to look at some key issues and some key ways of doing this. And one is partnerships, and looking at how we can work in partnerships. And so, I mean, we've reached out to Barbara Perry and had her come out and give some training to our crew here before. We reach out to local partnerships. We work with also federal partners at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. So partnerships are key. Just as important as local coalitions. So creating coalitions that allow people on the ground to build subject matter expertise, to move on action. And so, we've supported the Coalitions Creating Equity, and which is very similar to the Not in Our Town initiatives that have been done in the States, but creating and giving individuals and organizations the opportunity to stand up to hate and racism and to address it. One of the things we learned early on when we started doing this work 20 years ago is that it's not appropriate and not right for individual communities to, like the B'nai B'rith, to always be saying, hey, this happened against us, it's not right. It's for all of us in our communities to stand up against Islamophobia, against anti-LGBT crimes, wherever it's about for all of us to stand up. So the coalition model allows that the voice of the many is more powerful than the voice of those few haters and their supporters. And the other thing that we've learned early on is, as everyone here knows, and I'm sure a lot of people online, is that this work can be lonely work. We're a lot of the times we're in our own bubble, we're working hard, we don't know where to go. And so for us practitioners to build ourselves a community, our own tribe, that we can support each other, that we can celebrate Barbara today for her accomplishments and everyone here, but as well as we can cry on each other's shoulders, that we can go and we can say, hey, I've got a problem. Can you help me out? I just had a bad day. Things didn't work out, whether it's legislative or in community, but to build that community. And research. Research is important. One of the things the committee has been, started and, has been a big supporter and have not only done our own research, which actually we're doing right now. We're doing some research across Alberta to talk to victimized communities, marginalized communities, and their advocates. But to get that data, it's important, because if we don't have the data, we cannot inform good policy. And last but not least, education and awareness. We need to give people the power to advocate themselves, to make good decisions, to make sure to keep organizations or law enforcement's feet to the fire. We have had lots of, I'm sure everyone has had lots of anecdotal where somebody has a hate crime or incidents, they go to make a complaint, but then they're said, oh, the frontline person says, oh, this is not something that we can do. And so, but if we give power to the people, they can advocate to their enforcement, to their politicians to say, no, we need this addressed. And because of organizations like ours in the civil society, we're able to move the bar and help everyone have that knowledge that helps them move forward. Thanks a lot, and good luck, Barbara, and I hope everyone keeps the great work that they're doing.
Great. Thanks for that, Cam. I really appreciate it. Great to highlight Canadian doings in this space. We're a small community of hate crime scholars, practitioners, however you want to describe it, in the Canadian context. So locally, these partnerships have been very important. And I think your last slide there, Cam, really encapsulated what our aims are with the, just as I think Amanda did in some ways, encapsulated what the aims are of the chair, to be that conduit, to be a site in which we can bring these kinds of partnerships, coalitions, communities of practice together under a larger tent. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for your incredible insights. I think there was a lot of learning, a lot of really important revelations that many of us probably sitting here, especially those of us in Canada or the US, for example, are perhaps a little less familiar, a lot less familiar with what's happening outside of North America, even what's happening outside of Europe. So to get such a broad global perspective on the contours of hate and hostility is really important. But I think there's important threads that cut across the conversations, and I think I've sort of listed half a dozen takeaways. I think there are many more, but the first is coming back to that notion of the embeddedness of the prerequisites for individualized and localized forms of hatred, that they are embedded in our histories, they are embedded in the structures and institutions that guide our society, they're embedded in the narratives that we've used to construct our national mythologies very often as well. Amanda, I don't think I'd ever heard the whisk reference, and I think that was really important. It harks back to some of the North American language as well. So there's embeddedness. The other thing that I think is, sort of an extension of that is the normalization of hate that many of you have talked about, what I've referred to as the climate of hate that allows it to persist, that provides a platform through political narratives, through political leadership, that provides a platform, provides a jumping off point for individual acts of violence and for broader patterns and movements associated with the far right, for example, or other hate groups more broadly. I think it also reminds us how universal the problem is, that there is no culture, no community, I think, that is unfazed by the myriad problems, whether it's hate incidents and harassment at the lower end, or genocide at the other end. I mean, that is a continuum, right, Jennifer? We recently published a paper around that, but there is a continuum of hate, and I think we can learn from those that are sort of reaching that extreme end, where we can intervene at the nether regions, if you will. At the same time that these are universal patterns, obviously they're also embedded in the cultural specificity and cultural histories of each nation or each community that's experiencing these problems, and that's important to remind ourselves. I think empirically, 2 points leapt out at me. That is the unevenness of data collection at the local level, at the national level, across countries. And sometimes that's very conscious, right? It's very purposeful. If we don't gather the data, there's not a problem. If we don't have the data, there's not a problem. And that is a problem. At the other, and then the other end, even those countries that have official statistics, they're dramatically flawed, significantly flawed. I mean, when you have states in the US, for example, like Mississippi, that report no hate crimes, there's a problem there. So, what can we do? And, many of you mentioned these third-party reporting mechanisms as the Stop Hate AB, for example, and what role can they play and how can we support that? I think the other piece of that empirical basis is what I've referred to before, and some of you have also referenced, is the very Western focus in scholarship around hate crime. I will say, though, as I watch every week or every month, rather, I get the newsletter, the INHS newsletter, and which the INHS has just an absolutely incredible online library. I encourage you to go take a look at that. But one thing that I'm really noticing is, and Harsh, you'll be interested, that seems to be a lot of scholarship coming out of India now in this space. But I think that's one of the exceptions outside of Europe and North America and Australia, New Zealand. Very little scholarship in this space coming out of other countries. And the last thing that, again, I think that all of you pretty much closed with is the importance of the kinds of coalitions that we're trying to build here through the chair. That is the need for that cross-sectional, interdisciplinary, and in fact, comparative and international collaboration around research, around policy development and advocacy for policy development, around civil society organizations and the roles that they can play in developing anti-hate initiatives. How can we channel our very diverse and very impressive capacities here to lend a hand to those that might be looking for help and guidance in this space. So that's the tall order, I think, that we've set ourselves here with the chair. And so I really do very much look forward to working with all of you and others as well as we try and close some of these gaps, and as we try to do what we can individually and collectively to challenge hate, not just in our own corner of the world, but across the globe as well. So I'm going to turn now. I think we have a couple of comments and or questions in the Q&A, and if you have other questions, please do add them. Ferdas Ali, hi, thank you. Glad you joined us. Good to sort of see you again. Ferdas actually has a comment and a question, and Harsh will lead this to you. So she says, first, bravo, Harsh, for speaking out. And then for Harsh, is there any hope for India? And I think that raises an important point, as we know across the country, across the globe, the increasing threats and violence, in fact, and rhetoric directed towards not just journalists and politicians, but also academics and civil society organizations that work in this space and that challenge, especially challenge those patterns of normativity that we've been talking about. So, Harsh, what is your own situation in terms of your risk? And I sort of join Ferdas in congratulating you and thanking you for being so public, but also, where do you see, let's not just say, is there any hope for India, but where do you see cause for optimism? Oh, you're muted still, Harsh.
Yeah, thanks for those. Thanks, Barbara. Just very briefly about my own situation. It's become very dangerous to speak for love and solidarity. It's really quite extraordinary. I've been charged now with crimes for which I can spend this life and probably the next in prison. From hate mongering, terror, various other things, money laundering. I know all kinds of things, and it's basically, it's basically an attempt to silence work, which is really talking about love and solidarity. And it's extraordinary that it's so brazen, and I'm not alone. So for those, the reasons there are many reasons to feel a sense of despair, but there are still reasons for hope. The reason, it's probably the darkest time that we have passed through in the 75 years of our freedom, because of the dark clouds of hate and also fear if you speak out. So minorities and dissenters are being so openly targeted. Every single day, hardly, I'm saying this without exaggeration, hardly a day passes without a new outrage. And so little of it is reported in the rest of the world. And that's a huge problem. It's, India is, every sixth human being in the world is Indian. It is the world's largest democracy still, although breaking down. And if it breaks down, the world would be impacted, but there seems to be geopolitical reasons and so on for us to look away. But there is an extraordinary, climate of open hate. There's hate messaging from the very top of government. There's, we talked about normalizing hate. I think there's a valorizing of hate. It's not enough that it's not just normal and acceptable, but it's heroic. That you can prove you love your country by hating. Hating Pakistan. You can love your religion by only hating other religions and so on, which is a very extraordinarily long way that we've moved from Mahatma Gandhi, who actually taught us how to fight without hate, and that if you truly believe in your religion, you will be respectful to every other faith. And there can be no religious faith which is founded on hatred of others. I mean, that we moved a very, very long distance. Also, that people like us who are speaking out are fewer and fewer because the costs are very high, and so there seems to be a silent acceptance. Comparing with Germany, I looked carefully at Nazi Germany. The horror of the 1930s in Germany, I think, is not so much Hitler as ordinary people and the degree of ordinary people's support. And I think we need to recognize that we're seeing a growing radicalization of our populations. I mean, you spoke about Canada, you spoke about the United States, you spoke about Ireland and so on. And in my own country, Trump is not the horror, but how much support he has, and so on. So I think we need to recognize a kind of growing radicalization of the Indian Hindu that we are seeing on a daily basis. So all of these are reasons for despair. I'll just say that there's still reasons for hope. They're two or threefold. One of them is that India, we have a civilizational legacy, which is of caste and gender inequalities, which have been quite savage. But I think if we have something to be proud of, we are the most, we have been the most comfortable with diversity. Christianity came to India about less than 70 years after Christ, and settled down. Islam came, and so on. 8 major religions of the world have lived and prospered side by side comfortably. I think that legacy needs to be reclaimed and strengthened, and I think we still can. And lastly, that what gives me greatest hope is that it is, I'm not a Muslim. My family was in fact affected by huge violence in what is now in Pakistan, in partition, by violence by Muslim mobs. I am standing up in defense of India's Muslim minorities, and that's not exceptional. I think that solidarity is valuable, and most of all, it's ordinary people. So I still find, again, compared to Nazi Germany, you still find enough ordinary people who reach out in times of hate. There's been a huge movement against allowing Muslims to pray on Fridays in open spaces, and we had people saying, what's the problem? I'll open up my factory floor. You come on Friday afternoons. We'll open up the terraces of our homes. The Sikhs said, we'll open up our Sikh temples for you to pray. And as long as that happens, I think more than anything else, we still will overcome.
Thank you, Harsh. I think I'm moved and I'm encouraged by the fact that after all you've told us, you still do find those reasons for optimism. So thank you for sharing that. We have another question there from Dove Wimbish. I wonder if Claire can speak to the latest updates on the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan post-May 2020 exclusion from the country's National Commission for Minorities. What work is being done in this area? Is there work being done to address the normalized hatred they endure? That was addressed to you, Claire.
I'm sorry, we had a glitch in the connection. Can you say the question again?
Oh, sure. I wonder if you can speak to the latest updates on the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan post-May 2020 exclusion from the country's National Commission for Minorities. What work is being done in this area? Is there work being done to address the normalized hatred they endure?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, and hate is extreme in Pakistan, affecting the Ahmadiyya community. Part of the work we did in Pakistan was to track online and offline hate. And we looked at what linked a spike in hate. So, for example, if you have a religious festival in Pakistan, like Easter or a Hindu festival, you will immediately see a spike of hate against those communities, as well as mainstream Muslims who say, for example, Happy Christmas, or who participate in a diverse religious, experience in a tolerant way. But what was really interesting about the Ahmadis was there were no spikes, but there was a maintained level of hate throughout the whole year. So you didn't need any pretext or any provocation or reminder of the existence of another community to share hate speech against the Ahmadiyya community. But it's a very, very intractable issue. And, allegations of blasphemy are ongoing. Mob violence linked to blasphemy allegations or extrajudicial killings are ongoing. And it's extremely hard to get any shift in that at all. Desecration of graves, you name it, it's happening. And, we are supporting, what's very interesting as well about the Ahmadiyya hate is it's moving out of Pakistan. So the Pakistan government kind of petitions platforms quite regularly to have the Ahmadi sites taken down. So even, a site run out of London or a site run out of the US, the Ahmadi community may be needing to defend its right to say what it wants to in those contexts of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and belief, because of a complaint made that has originated in Pakistan. So I don't have any solutions. I'm not going to be as optimistic as Harsh was about India, I'm afraid, about its northern neighbor, where the Ahmadis are concerned. It is very intractable, and there's a great film that's doing the rounds, and I think it's going to be shown soon, called 298, which refers to an article of the Constitution. So if you have a chance to see that, I can try and tell Barbara about it, and she can circulate it through the group. But it should be coming to a venue not too far from you, and even Ireland. Amanda, there's a plan to show it in Ireland. So I'm not sure about Canada, sorry, but certainly on your side of the pond. So hopefully some of you might get to see it and join the worldwide campaign and that really tragic experience for those people.
Thank you for that, Claire. Yeah, as you say, intractable, as so many of the problems seem to be. Really a comment here from Davu Akka, who was one of our graduate students a few years back. He says, I just want to congratulate you, Dr. Perry, with your appointment as UNESCO chair. I really feel more hopeful for the future of the fight against hate all around the globe. Thank you for that, Davu. Good to hear from you. So a question here, if it is not possible to legislate our way out of hate, is there a way to legislate our way into respect and love? Is there a future for constitutions and constitutional reform in dismantling hate? And perhaps I'll bow to the legal scholars amongst us, our legal scholar. Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that? Give you a chance to speak, as she left us.
No, sorry, I was just arranging childcare. I'm absolutely mortified. My father had just called, so I just got the last part of your question. I do apologize. Would you mind answering it again?
Sure. She has such gorgeous children, by the way, as they both do. If it is not possible to legislate ourselves out of hate, is there a way to legislate our way into respect and love? Is there a future for constitutions and constitutional reform in dismantling hate?
Yeah, I think so. You know, in the same way that Barb, you know, you've written extensively about hate crime is a message crime, right? And in the same way that when we legislate against hate and when we legislate against crime, we are equally sending a message as legislators and as a society that this behavior is not something that we will tolerate. As to whether, and we use the criminal law to enforce that message, you know, so it's a tool that we use to enforce that message. As to whether we can constitutionally send a similar message of positivity, I don't know, like most constitutions, you know, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, we all have guarantees of equality in these, but they are typically, like, we have a guarantee of equality in our constitution, but it's poorly litigated, it's under litigated, it's under analysed. You know, I don't know much about the Canadian or South African or indeed any other constitutional understanding of equality, but it's sort of a negative right rather than a positive obligation. I think that there's a huge amount to be said for kind of the importance of politicians and their role and the role of any agency, state agency or state organization which wields the power of the state, where there should be positive obligations there for those individuals to behave at a level which is higher than that which we expect of society as a whole, you know, so that we should you know, and when we are faced with evidence of institutional racism, when we are faced with allegations of institutional bias, for example, that those institutions should respond and address that. And this kind of comes right around full circle, doesn't it? Because if institutions are like the police, for example, if are institutionally racist, then people from racialized minorities are less likely to report their experience to the police and less likely for that experience to be recognized by the system, and we're running in circles. So I think certainly that there should be means by which we can challenge those who wield the power of the state when they exert that power in a manner which is discriminatory, which is racist, which is transphobic, for example, and particularly politicians, that they should be subject to some form of sanction when they do so, including in the UK, where transphobia is now protected speech. It's hard to think that transphobia is now protected political speech. So I don't think we can make a law to make people like one another, but I think we can use the law as a tool for positive social change. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure it does. And apologies for being distracted.
No, I think it does answer the question. It's that tension, right? That we do need to hold political leaders accountable for responding when institutions are found to be problematic, and yet, at a time when so many political leaders are actually supportive of exactly those trends, we're in attention. And in fact, rather than holding political leaders to a higher standard, there are protections for their political statements, which seems counterintuitive. So no, I think you did answer the question. I appreciate that. Oh, my friend Nuzat Jaffrey. Hi, Nuzat. Good to have you on board. Has a couple of questions. First, thanks so much for an excellent panel and congratulations, Barb, on your appointment. A question for Cam. What is being done to capture intersectional aspects of hate crimes and hate incidents, intersections of gender, race, religion, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there is actually some movement on that in the last year or so. So, number one, from the police aspect, law enforcement, federally as well as local law enforcement, they're moving towards collecting data from both complainants and from police officers on people self-identify, so on disaggregated demographic data. So for people to self-identify, their identity and who they are, and maybe why they're being victims, but as well also from the side of the police officer to also collect that data. So they're looking at collecting those two parts of demographic data, which will then be able to, once we have that data through Stats Canada and other means, we'll be able to look at intersectionality. Human rights commissions as well across the country, including the Canadian Human Rights Commission, they're also commissions are also moving to collecting demographic data from complainants. And so when people make complaints on discrimination grounds to those commissions, that data will be able to be, it won't just be on grounds and areas, that'll be on the person's identity. And again, it's going to be, it's not mandatory, but we're assuming we'll get some good response from people reporting that, which will look at both, which will also help both organizations, law enforcement, police, look at their the way that they're addressing systemic issues within their complaint processes, but as well as the outcomes. Look at what are the outcomes for marginalized people going through those government systems. So it's looking optimistic, because I think we all know that data is king.
Yeah, great, Cam. Yeah, there have been some really dramatic changes of late, and I think that's an important shift. Okay, another question from Dove. The question is for anyone. One or two of you spoke to violence against trans and LGBTQIA+ communities around the world. I can't recall who, but one of you spoke about all the quantitative research being done. So much about the issues surrounding the queer communities essentially can't be quantified because we don't keep the quantitative data. We have stories, we have art, we have music. We have people desperately trying to exercise voice, and that speaks to a more qualitative approach to the research we do on hate against these communities. Can anyone speak on the effectiveness of qualitative research on political policy with regards to these communities in your country or countries? And I'm just going to intervene here actually a little bit and say, I mean, much of the work that I do myself is qualitative. I often sort of do mixed methods, but I really highlight the qualitative pieces, which I think is so important because it's nuanced. It really does tell the full story rather than just, who was affected and what was the nature of that incident. It speaks, has the capacity to speak much more to how those incidents are experienced, what the impacts are, what the contexts are, how people understand them as being hate motivated. In terms of how that plays into the policy piece, I have a bit of an anecdote there, which is really interesting. This was around Islamophobia. I was asked to testify, act as expert witness some time ago on a case potentially involving Islamophobia. And the sitting judge actually rejected my testimony and my report because it was based on qualitative data, which from his perspective was purely anecdotal and not systematic. So I think that there is commonly a tendency to not understand the value of qualitative research. Now, having said that, I have recently done some work with EGAL Canada and with Justice Canada on a really interesting here. Justice Canada had done a quantitative study of serious legal, what they framed as serious legal issues facing a whole array of communities. And we actually won the contract to do a follow-up qualitative research with LGBT communities specifically to unpack some of what they had found in the quantitative. So there's Justice Canada, right, asking for that qualitative research to shape their decision-making going forward. So I think it's rather uneven and often depends on the people in place. So perhaps I'll open it up to some others of you in the research community and what your experiences have been in terms of the uptake of the qualitative data.
Barbara, I just wanted to add something from the advocate's position on that. It's the qualitative data that provides the narratives and the storytelling and the context that is so incredibly vital to push for policy change and whatnot. So I can't think of a case where I've testified in Congress or somewhere else without using qualitative data as the frame, right? As the basic narrative that the data then sort of fills out.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Perhaps coming with the experience in South Africa. So I spoke to the John Killarney homophobic hate speech case and the expert evidence that we gave in that court. If it weren't that we had 2 studies that were published in the Psychological Society of South Africa journal, the Journal of Psychology, of South Africa for that matter, that indeed were empirical, I think we wouldn't have had a case to take to the court, because policymakers in South Africa, the legal system significantly so, seem to prioritize empirical data, and indeed we've got too little of the empirical data. So from that perspective, certainly, I think it was essential that we had those 2 studies to be able to quote. I think it's the similar reason why the Hate Crimes Working Group wanted to do that first empirical study that I referred to, that longitudinal study. And again, it's gappy. Certainly, I mentioned that it was a convenient study of sampling. So certainly anything but a perfect piece of evidence to bring to the table, but it swayed policymakers. Back to the Quilani case, what was interesting is in the actual courts, it was the story of a Black African lesbian who spoke about significant so-called corrective rape experiences that made an incredible impression on the judge. So it's certainly not an either or, and indeed our empirical data, but the narrative of that victim of homophobic rape certainly made a significant impression.
Great, thank you, Juan. And Amanda. I think Amanda has frozen.
I think she has frozen, but I very much suspect I know what she's going to say. So I will start talking and she will come in to finish my sentence, if that's okay. I suspect that what she was going to say is that for small communities which are scattered across, oh, there she's gone now. Oh, she's run out of battery. She just sent me a message. She said she'd be back on in 2 minutes. That we don't have a choice sometimes but to gather data qualitatively, and certainly, you know, the idea of, there's Amanda there now, I was just trying to answer the question in the way that you would, Amanda, but the idea is sort of that randomized survey approach, every 10th number in the phone book, and if they don't answer, take one up or one down, or the knock on every 4th door just isn't appropriate with respect to collecting data with minority communities and minoritized communities. Amanda, I was just trying to answer the question. I'm doing a very bad job of being a sociologist, so I'll hand back over to you.
Jennifer, you do an excellent job of being a sociologist. You went to the dark side a long time ago. I think one of the key points to make here is that if legislators and policymakers want to pursue a particular path, the difficulty can be sometimes that if they are determined to ignore evidence in order to pursue that path, it doesn't matter what type of evidence you are actually presenting to them. And I do find that while numbers are very persuasive, that sometimes numbers can be dismissed because you can paint numbers as having been manipulated by the researcher. When you present people's stories, those in their own words, that's much harder to dismiss or to deny. And so I find that the combination of the two, having the numbers that speak to the overall picture and then the words of the people with expertise on their own lived experience, that combination is particularly powerful. And it's important because it's powerful in persuading legislators and policymakers, but it's also powerful in terms of swaying the public. And the public are really important, because if you can get public buy-in for an action that needs to be taken, it is very difficult for their public representatives to stand against them.
Thanks,
You're on
Amanda.
mute
I
there,
think
Bob.
Cam wanted to follow up.
Yeah, and just and very similarly to that point, one of the things that we've done in Alberta is using a PAR approach, participatory action research, and so it's getting community involved, so that way they are also part of the knowledge keepers. So we're not taking their knowledge and doing something with it. We're convening the knowledge, giving it back to them, so local communities in those small rural areas as well as the big cities, they can actually activate on that information. And so we're a big fan of getting that qualitative information and as well as a quantitative, a mixed methodology, but giving it back to communities so they can localize it both at a municipal level, but also at a grassroots level to take action.
Yeah, great reminder there. Thanks for that. I'm gonna skip one question because there's a couple of related questions, then I'll come back. So Lala Gunaratne says, I agree, stories of lived experiences are so important in bringing the issues to the fore that can change institutionalized racism and discrimination at the core. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And then Dan Cullen asks, would you say that in general, quantitative data has greater barriers to entry to produce when compared to the anecdotal qualitative evidence that tells stories? I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I think it's more about, which of these methodologies is sort of easier in terms of soliciting support and participation by communities. Amanda, is that a new hand or old hand?
That's a new hand. And I think that it depends on the community, but for example, sometimes you'll have communities which maybe are more privileged in terms of things like educational access and so on, which will make quantitative research, particularly like self-administered surveys and so on, more feasible to conduct with those communities. But quantitative research can be more difficult, I think, to pursue with people whose marginalization manifests in particular as educational disadvantage and, for example, lower levels of literacy. And then I think Dove, who asked a question earlier, pointed to the issue that for some communities have very strong oral traditions. So the way that they communicate, the way that they have always passed down learning is through stories, and trying to impose our way of making knowledge upon another community is perhaps particularly inappropriate in the type of research that we do. So I think that it's important to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I would certainly say that in terms of the resources involved, that conducting qualitative research is incredibly resource heavy, but always worth it.
Agreed. And I think also heavy emotional labor very often doing that qualitative research. Yeah, but yeah, as you say, the voice is so important. And the last thing that we have in the Q&A,
I've got one comment here. One of the reasons that the hate crime committee got into doing more qualitative was because when we went to policymakers, the numbers are so low, as we all know. The reported numbers to police on hate crimes is so low, it barely makes a dent on our stats can or reporting. And so we really needed to have those voices heard. So back to evidence and back to policymakers, we were actually told by the policymakers in our province they needed more data, and that was our best way of getting it, was the qualitative.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Good. Okay, so the last thing that we have in the Q&A at this point is actually a comment and a suggestion for some materials, and I'll post that in the chat because I don't think everyone can see the Q&A. Again, from Lilith, excellent dialogue. Thank you so much for the rich presentations. I was an immigrant to Toronto, Canada in 1973 from Sri Lanka, and this blog tells the story of my welcome there and the positive political and policy actions that enabled Canada to be more proactive in creating a multicultural multicultural nation. So I'm going to actually post that, the link in the chat. Okay, there you go. And another comment, very welcome here from our good friend, Rob Halpin. On behalf of Organized Labor in Ontario, we are so pleased to see recognition as UNESCO Chair for Dr. Perry in furthering each of the panelists' collective work on a global scale. We're ready to support your work at every opportunity possible, Dr. Perry, including resourcing and providing access to our membership to further our collective goals. Best, Rob Halpin, OFL, that's the Ontario Federation of Labor, Executive Director. Rob is a long friend of the faculty and of the center. So thanks for that comment, Rob. I really appreciate it. And we will be reaching out. So open your pockets. Okay, I think that is it for the Q&A. So thank you for that engagement. I really appreciated the questions and the comments from our attendees. So I think if there's nothing that any of you are burning to add to the conversation, I will say thank you once again to all of those who have supported me through this. I was remiss at the top for not thanking my advancement officer, Leanne Good, who has been incredible in terms of helping to raise funds for the center and now for the chair, but also the work that she did in helping us to bring this forum to life. So thanks, Leanne, for all of the work that you do and all the support that you've given me. I think it was an incredible panel, and I really look forward to having more of these very international global exchanges of ideas, whether they're public or whether they're small working groups. I think that, you know, there's a lot that we have to do and a lot that we can do to enhance the inclusivity and welcomeness of the communities that we live in. So again, I thank everyone for being here and for the long-term support you've given me and for the friendships, old and new, that we will forge through the chair. So I thank you. Peter, did you want to take the space for any closing comments?
Well, just to thank everyone who participated. It was a very engaging discussion, absolutely, as expected. I think we've got a neat topic perhaps for a workshop on methodology. Right? I mean, I was very engaged by that discussion as an academic, of course, and that could be something that we can think about holding. But many other issues, of course, that were raised, very pertinent to what's happening today around the world. So, and congratulations, Barb. This took a while, but we got there. And as you said, though, now it's time to, as you're always doing, keep on working.
More of the same.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But it's been a very nice event, and thank you so much for participating around the world and at different times in your day too. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, everyone, take care. Thank you all so much. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.